If you are looking for a unique, affordable, and easy DIY project that is guaranteed to be one of this year's top sellers, look no further. Making unique projects is the name of the game, and in this week's video we're going to be pushing it over the top with this beautiful windmill and planter stand. Not only is this a super easy DIY project, but everything here is made with a 2x4 and a few fence pickets. Let me show you how. Okay, so to start with, let's go ahead and make the box for this thing. It'll be the part that sits on the top of the legs that actually supports the windmill. And for this, I'm going to use fence pickets. Now, you don't necessarily have to use fence pickets. You can actually use plywood. I actually prototyped this thing out using plywood. Plywood is going to be a lot easier to use, but it's not going to last as long in the elements. So fence pickets it is. So I'm going to start off by cutting my boards to the length. But I'm going to be needing 4 boards that are 12 inches long, 2 boards at 6 1/4 inch long, 1 board at 7 1/4, and 1 board at 7 3/4. These will be all the parts that you'll need to make the house. After we get our boards cut to length, let's take our 4 12-inch boards and our 2 6 1/4 inch boards over to the table saw. And as always, I'm going to teach you step by step on how to make this entire build. But if you're a plans in the hand type of person, head over to my website. I'll throw a link in the description. I get a lot of comments about my safety glasses. For years, I've chosen to use Gator's safety glasses because of their resistance to scratching, fogging, even with a mask, and their ballistic lenses. And they're also really light and comfortable. If you'd like to check them out, I'll make sure to throw a link in the description. The 4 12-inch boards, we'll rip those down to 5 1/4. The 2 6 1/4 boards, let's rip those down to 4 1/2 inches wide. As for the 7 1/4 and the 7 3/4 inch board, we're going to leave those at 5 1/2 inches wide. With all of our little, I guess we'll just call it the house part of this, cut to size, let's go ahead and get some of these parts assembled. So the 12-inch boards, we're going to be using those for the front and back. The 6 1/2 inch boards, we're going to be using those for our sides. And then the 7 1/4 and 7 3/4, that's actually going to be the top. That's why one's a little bit longer than the other so that it can overlap. But before we mess with these, let's go ahead and assemble and cut our sides. So for our 4 side boards, we're going to be joining these together in pairs to make our 2 sides. Whenever we're done, you'll have a 10 1/2 inch by 12 inch front and back board. So to assemble these, after I've paired my boards up, I'm going to make a mark at 2 inches and 10 inches. And these marks would just be for screw placement. Now that I have my screw placement marked, I'm going to take 2 of my boards and head over to Craig's 720 Pro. I'll set my drill bit collar to 1/2 inch and then cut my pocket holes on my marks. So now with my pocket holes cut, I'm going to go ahead and add in some wood glue and some 1-inch pocket hole screws. And the reason why I'm using 1-inch pocket hole screws for these is because fence pickets have gotten thinner. They used to all be right around 5/8 or 3/4 inch. Now they all seem to be right around 1/2 inch thick. So now we need to cut a couple of angles onto our front and back boards. I'm going to go ahead and stack these on top of each other with the screws facing up. Now I'm going to set my saw to 8 degrees to the left. I'll make this cut starting with the edge closest to me. That edge will be the bottom of our boxes, and I want those to stay right at 12 inches long. And with my saw still at 8 degrees, I'm simply going to flip my boards over and make this exact same cut. Now your board should look something like this. We need to make a couple more cuts, then we'll put this thing together. Now let's readjust our saw to 34 degrees to the left. Then I'm going to put my angled edge against the fence with the narrowest side facing the blade. Now I'm going to measure over 4 1/2 inches and make a mark. And that'll be the center of my narrowest side. Then I'll use that center mark to make my first cut. I'll flip my boards over, remeasure, and then make my second cut. So now that our front and backs are done, let's go ahead and attach our side walls. Now for these side walls, I actually left them a little bit long, just in case anyone wants to actually cut the angle into the edge of the board. Since there's not going to be a bottom in this, and the tops are going to be covered with a roof, I'm just going to shorten mine to fit. So basically mine will fit something like this. It'll be flush at the top and flush at the bottom. The ends just won't be on the same angle as the edges. If you're fine with the ends not matching the angle, go ahead and cut your sideboards down to 5 7/8. So one last thing that I'm going to do to the front and back before I assemble this, I'm going to line these up and go ahead and install a hole that we'll be using later. And to do this, I'm going to be using this seam or the joint that we made using the pocket hole screws. I'm going to measure over 5 1/4 inch and make a mark right on that seam. Use a 1/2 inch drill bit and a drill guide and drill straight through both my parts. This is going to save us some headache on a future step. So now that we have our holes drilled, I'm going to put one of my boards with the screws facing up. This will be my back. Then I'll set my two sideboards in place. We'll add some wood glue, line up our edges with our top board, and lock these into place using some brad nails. Now the brad nails will temporarily hold this into place until I can get some screws installed. Once we have our front attached to our sides, we'll just simply flip this over and install our back. Now to permanently lock this down, I'm going to measure from the bottom 1 inch and 5 inch. This will be my screw placement on all 4 sides. Then I'll measure 1/4 inch in, pre-drill, and install 1 inch exterior screws. Okay, so now that we have the base frame of this built, let's go ahead and throw this roof on and then move to the legs. Now to install the roof, I'm going to run wood glue down both of my ridges. Then I'm going to install my 7 1/4 inch board even with the top of my ridge. Then my 7 3/4 inch board will overlap the 7 1/4. Now I'm just going to install a couple screws like we did on our front and back. And we're ready to move on. And for these, I'll just install at 1 inch and 6 inch on all 4 sides. Had a little bit of a split out there. I'll show you what I'm going to do to fix this. While it's still split, I'm going to push some wood glue down in there. And then I'm going to back this screw out. And with the screw backed out, I can either clamp this and let it sit, or I can throw a brad nail on the side. Now with that split fixed, I'm just going to ease my screw back in. Now with that essentially clamped together with my brad nail, I'm going to leave this screw a little proud until this dries. Now with our little house put together, let's go ahead and cut our legs and get those attached. So for our legs, I want 4 boards that are 1 inch by 1 inch by 59 inches long. So to get this, I'm just going to take some 2x material and rip it down into 1 inch strips. That'll give me a 1 inch by 1 1/2. And that's all I have to do is flip this material over and cut off that extra 1/2 inch, leaving me with a 1x1. And while I'm at the table saw with my 2x material, I'm going to go ahead and rip a couple of strips that are 3/4 inch wide. We'll be using those shortly as our leg braces. All right, so now that we have our leg stock cut, 1 by 1 by 59. And then we also have some 3/4 by 1.5 inch material for our braces. Let's head over to the miter saw and get these cut. So for our legs, we're going to put an 8-degree angle on one end of each board. And to cut our leg braces, we are going to leave the saw at 8 degrees. For the top 2 braces, I'll make 1 cut, flip that board over, measure down 10 3/8, and then make my second cut. You'll need 2 of these. Then for the bottom 2 braces, you'll just repeat this step, only changing the length. We'll need 15 1/2 inches from tip to tip. Now that we have all of our leg parts cut, let's go ahead and put these together. For the assembly of your legs, you'll need a straight edge of some sort. This could be the edge of your table or a large square. So with my legs laid out at roughly 18 3/4 inch, I'm going to go ahead and clamp my top. And this clamp doesn't need to be tight. It just needs to hold the top 2 boards so that the tips are touching. Now that the tops are locked together, let's go ahead and square our legs up to our straight edge. We want these 8-degree angles flush against our straight edge, which will leave us at 18 3/4 from tip to tip spacing. Now to lay out the position of my braces. Using the outside edge of the leg, I'm going to measure up 12 inches and 30 inches. I'll do this for both my boards, and now I'm ready to install the braces. For this, I'll be needing 1 top brace and 1 bottom brace. With a 30-inch mark at the bottom of my top brace, I'm going to attach this to my legs using wood glue and brad nails. And I'm only going to put a few brad nails in because I'm going to come back and use screws for this. And then for the bottom brace, I'll install this the exact same way at the 12-inch mark. And I'm just going to pre-drill and countersink before locking this down with an 1.25 inch exterior deck screws. And a huge shout out to the Patreon community for making this channel possible. If you're interested in supporting the channel or finding out what this community is all about, stop by and check it out. I'll make sure to throw a link on my website and in the description. Okay, so with our first leg assembly put together, we'll just have to repeat this step for our second one. Once we get that done, we'll tie it into our top. Okay, so to attach our top, I'm just going to take one of my legs, then I'll turn it over so that our braces are against our table. I'm going to let the end of this just hang over the edge of my table. Then from the end of each leg, I'm going to measure 5 inches down, mark the outsides of my board, and then use those marks to draw a line. We'll be using this line to connect our top. So this line will ultimately be where the box attaches to our legs. But before we do that, let's line our box up with our marks underneath of our legs, and then just trace the outline of the legs onto the box side. The reason why we're doing this is so that when we put the legs on the inside, we'll know where to place our screws from the outside. So now that we have that marked, let's go ahead and attach our box to our legs. I'm just going to put some wood glue on the outside, slide our box over our legs, and bring the side down to our marks that we made earlier. Then I'm just going to center this up with my legs, leaving 7/8 of an inch overhang on each side. And then just to hold this into place, I'm going to throw in a couple of brad nails. And then using the outline that we made earlier, I'm going to mark placement for screws that are 1 inch from the bottom and 3 inches from the bottom. And then for our second leg, I'm going to repeat the measurement of 5 inches down and using that as a guide. Once I have my angles marked out, I'm going to go ahead and mark my 1 inch and 3 inch screw placement. Okay, so this is what we have now. And to install our second leg, I'm just going to slide it underneath, and let's find our 5 inch mark that we made on our leg. Once we have that lined up, we'll measure for center and then throw in a couple of brad nails to hold this into place. And since I already have my screw placement marked, I'll pre-drill, countersink, and throw in some screws. Okay, so this thing is coming together and looking great. So for this next step, let's go ahead and cut our parts and assemble our fans and blades. So to make our fan parts and the supports, I'm going to be using fence picket material. For this X support that will actually hold the fan blades, you're going to need 2 boards that are 2 inches by 32 inches long. And then for the blades themselves, I just ripped down a fence picket into 7/8 inch strips. So let's go ahead and add a bevel to our blade supports so that each blade sits at an angle like a traditional windmill. And to do this, we're going to start by angling our blade to 45 degrees. Then we'll move our fence over to 1.5 inches and run our 2 inch material through. Once both parts have been ran through once, we're just going to flip our material around and make the exact same cut on the opposite side. All right, so both of our 2 inch strips now look like this. Just 2 inch strips with 45s on both sides. So for connecting our blade supports, there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. You could half flap these two and they would set into each other perfectly. But since this material is only around 1/2 inch thick and this is set up for decoration, I'm just going to overlap these. So to do this, since my boards are 2 inches wide, on one of my blade supports I'm going to make a mark at the 15 inch and 17 inch mark. Next I'm going to take a square and mark my lines. Now with the lines on my first board marked, I'm just going to line these two up together and transfer this mark to my second board. And to join these, I'm just going to put some wood glue on my bottom board and then use the marks on my boards to line these up for square. You could also use a square for this. Once I get it where I want it, I'm going to throw in a couple of brad nails, and then I'm going to flip my boards over, mark the edges of my bottom board just to use as reference. Then I'm going to mark 1 inch in on both of my reference lines. We'll go ahead and join those two marks. Then I'm going to mark for screw placement centered 1/2 inch in from both of our reference lines. So it should look something like this. I'm just going to pre-drill and install some 1 inch screws. Since this is going to be on the back of the windmill, I'm not going to countersink these screws. I want to be careful that they don't pop out the other side. So one last thing to do before we assemble our fans and attach them. That's going to be to drill our hole for our dowel rod that will run through our top box. So for the hole for my dowel rod, I'll be making it 1/2 inch, just like I did for the top. I want that to fall right in between my 2 screws or in the very center of this board. So that's going to be 16 inches in from the end. I'm going to make a mark and line that up with my center line that I made earlier. And since I do not want my dowel to come out the other side, and we are roughly right about 1 inch thick total, I'm going to go ahead and mark my drill bit. Since Craig's drill guide is 1 inch thick, and that's what I'll be using, I'm just going to measure down my bit to 1.75 inches, and then throw in some painter's tape. And then I'll go ahead and take my little spring punch here and make a starter divot. This will help keep my bit from walking. Now with everything marked, I can drill my hole. So now this thing is ready for the fan blades. So let's go ahead and put those together. And for that, we'll be using the 1 inch strips that we cut earlier. So again, each one of these strips are made from picket material and they're 7/8 of an inch wide. I'll be needing 8 parts that are 12 inches long for the top and the bottom of these fans, and then 28 parts that are 6 inches long that will be our slats. And for anyone out there that has always wanted to make something like this, but thought that you could not afford to get into woodworking, make sure to head over to my website and check out the new woodworking Kickstart course. I'll show you how you can get into woodworking from scratch for less than the cost of this cell phone. So with all of my parts cut and separated into 4 sets, let's start putting these things together. And for this, I'm going to be using my square, wood glue, and 7/8 inch brad nails. I'm going to start off with my first strip flush with the ends of my top and bottom. Then I'm just going to flip that around and do the exact same thing for the opposite side. This will give us support on both ends. Now that we have our 2 ends, we have our 5 center pieces. And just to make things easier and keep us from having to break things down into 30 seconds and all of that, I'm just going to use a scrap piece of 7/8 inch material as my spacer. And I'll just keep working my way down until my first fan is complete. The second from the last slat is going to be just a little closer to the end than the rest. the last inner slat, I'm just going to space this one by eye. After I get my first one done, I'll lay my next two top and bottom boards against my square and use my first one as a jig to go ahead and put down my wood glue. I'm just going straight out from my other slats. And I'll space these back out and repeat this for the rest of my fans. Right, so now that we have all of our little fan blades made and our blade support, I'm going to start off by putting a little wood glue on each one of my slats right above one of my vertical boards. Once we have our glue in place, we're going to take our fan brace and we're going to set it right on the edge of that vertical board and tilt the fan until it's flush on that 45-degree angle. One thing to keep in mind is we want the edge of the fan flush with the edge of the support. And with the support laying flat, it should look like this. Once you have everything lined up to where you want it, let's go ahead and put a brad nail on each one of our slats. Now we'll just repeat this for our other three. When you're installing your fans, just make sure that you're installing on the exact same side on every single blade. And there we have it. No, actually it's really cool even if it's just for decoration. So to attach these two, I'm going to be using this 1/2-inch piece of dowel rod that's 8.5 inches long. I'm going to start off by pre-drilling a hole through my dowel rod about 1/4 inch from one end. Then using that hole, I'm going to install a screw through the end. Then I'm going to take this dowel rod and from the back and the screw facing out, I'm going to feed this through this 1/2-inch hole that we drilled earlier. Push the rod all the way until the screw is seated against the back. Now let's attach the fan. I'm going to put some wood glue in the bottom of this. I want to make sure that it gets in there really good. You kind of line this up the way that you'd like it. I want mine to go opposite directions and then seat this over the dowel rod. And this is what it's looking like. I think it's looking pretty good. Once that wood glue sets up, this isn't going anywhere. If you'd like, you can find the very center of this fan and put a screw through your blades and into your dowel. All right, so this next step is going to be kind of optional on what you would like to do. I'm going to build a couple of simple boxes just to put on these bottom supports. You could also add extra supports to the front and the back and make this a trellis. Completely up to you. So to keep everything super simple for these boxes, I'm going to be using fence picket material that has been ripped down to 5 inches wide. The only differences in material will be the length. I've decided to build my boxes with kind of like a rustic look, just to kind of match the old windmill theme. So for the small box, you'll need 3 boards that are 21 inches long and 2 boards that are 5 inches long. So these are 5 by 5. Then for the larger bottom box, you'll need 4 boards that are 26 inches long and 2 boards that are 10 inches long. I'm going to start off with a rough frame assembly just using butt joints and brad nails, and then I'll go back and put in some wood screws. So I'm just going to add some wood glue to the edges of my end pieces and then slide the fronts and backs into place and then throw in some brad nails all the way around. Now for the bottom board, you can either center that in the very middle and then you'll have a little bit of overhang. I'm going to go ahead and just split this down the middle, bring it out, that way we'll have a little gap for drainage. I'm just going to put some wood glue around all of my edges and then attach my bottom. Now if you don't want this big of a gap, you could easily rip another piece and put in there, but most likely potted plants will be in this. And our box is as simple as that. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for our large box. Now whenever we get to the bottom, we're just going to leave this gap in the middle like we did for the smaller box. So like I said earlier, I'm going to go ahead and go back and put some screws in this box as well. But if you're comfortable just using brad nails and the exterior wood glue, go for it. And there it is. Just using some construction grade lumber and some fence pickets, we were able to make a windmill. And that's pretty cool. And if you're interested in making these things to sell, I think they'll sell like crazy because there's nothing out there like it. And the best thing about this build is that it's super cheap and super easy to make.